We begin now this segment on the Spanish-American War. 1898, war with Spain. How does it get started? How does it go? And what are the repercussions? Well, the Spanish-American War, as it's so called, really is focused on the Caribbean and on the Pacific. And more specifically, on Cuba, the island of Cuba, 90 miles off the coast of Florida, and a group of islands known as the Philippines in the Pacific. As far as Cuba goes, Cuba had been, and in fact was the last of the major Spanish-American holdings left over from colonial days, when the Spanish had first encountered and then come to control a vast swath of the Americas in the very late 15th and then into the 16th centuries. In 1895, Cuban revolutionaries rose up against their Spanish overlords. There were claims of Spanish misrule and abuse. And another problem that these revolutionaries sort of considered was that so long as Cuba was not attached to the United States, it was forced to pay those sugar duties that we just talked about in connection with Hawaii. Remember that what happens in Hawaii is driven in no small part because of taxes or tariffs that are placed on sugar. The Cubans were willing to devastate their own island to force the Spanish to leave. And the Spanish, given the virulence of the revolution and the violence that was encountered, had no qualms about using whatever methods, however brutal, to squash the rebellion. The result, among other things, was disease and death on a horrendous scale. It was also government brutality, as the Spanish arrested and held people suspected of contributing to the rebellion in Cuba. And often they held these folks in conditions that, according to many observers, were simply inhumane. Vast camps where populations would be concentrated, where disease could spread, where the conditions in terms of hygiene, food, etc. were just simply inexplicably poor. I mean, part of this business of putting down an insurgency or rebellion, part of war itself, always seems to have been the necessity, ultimately, of going after the citizenry, going after the non-combatants to destroy the capacity of combatants to continue the fight. We see it through history again and again and again. The American press, newspapers, journals, magazines, pick up and began to follow with great care events in Cuba. We speak as historians about the era of yellow journalism or the yellow press, and I don't know if it's just one era. It seems like it goes on and on and on, but by the 1890s, newspapers were being read extraordinarily widely. These cheap penny dailies, often, really trying to sell papers, they would move toward what we consider today sort of a tabloid-style journalism. That which was spectacular, that which was extraordinary or extreme, whatever would make headlines and sell newspapers, that's what could make its way into the newspaper. And that's what's sort of meant by yellow journalism. A journalism that is some ways more concerned with spectacle than necessarily with just relating the news. Well, it makes sense that the ferocity in Cuba would find its way into the American press. Indeed, the American yellow press was full of lurid stories of, inhumane treatment, rape, pillage, you name it. And they weren't above exaggeration or falsehood to sell papers. As William Randolph Hearst of the New York Journal is said to have said, "You furnished the pictures," he said to one of his photographers being sent to Cuba, "and I'll furnish the war." In other words, Hearst is effectively saying that he's willing to act to actually change events on the ground in order to sell newspapers. Maybe it's an apocryphal story, but it catches the essence of how newspapers were operating. And it wasn't just the New York Journal. Joseph Pulitzer, another of the major newspaper figures in the United States at this time, will be also engaged in this sort of tabloid journalism. There's a great deal of competition among newspapers to get the story and get the best story. But you have to remember that the public is reading and they're picking up on these ideas, true or not, false or not, good or not. American presidents, by and large, had sought to keep the United States out of any kind of direct intervention in Cuba or war with Spain. Initially, William McKinley did the same. He called on the Spanish to modify their actions, especially when it came to these concentration camps where conditions were so bad. And for a while, early in McKinley's presidency, right, he's elected in 96, so 97, it appears that a great deal of the insurrectionary fervor in Cuba is dying down. But then, in February of 1898, a Cuban agent is intercepted with a private letter to the Spanish minister to Washington, D.C., a gentleman by the name of Dupuy de Lome. This letter makes its way to William Randolph Hearst, who determines to publish the letter in the New York Journal. The letter itself describes William McKinley, the president, as weak and a slave of popular opinion, suggesting that McKinley will do nothing to interfere with the Spanish until such time as the American public becomes so outraged they're willing to see him act. News of the letter from de Lome will encourage the development of just such an angry public opinion among U.S. newspaper readers and the public at large. Then in February of 1898, an explosion rips through an American battleship, the Maine. There had been riots in Havana, Cuba, in January of 1898, and so the United States had sent the Maine to demonstrate concern, to what you might call show the flag, to announce that there was an American presence and we were well armed. And also the Maine was sent to protect the interests of citizens. Now this included, of course, citizens with considerable investments in Cuba. When the Maine exploded, some 260 sailors were killed. And while it was decades and decades before there was any opportunities for sort of a forensic investigation, the idea was that the Maine had been destroyed by the Spanish, that there had been treachery afoot. And that's the way it played out in the yellow press. March 1898, William McKinley asks Spain for an armistice. That's a cessation of the fighting in Cuba. He asks that they sit down with the revolutionaries and negotiate a peace. He also suggests that what is warranted, besides just a ceasing of hostilities, is an option for Cuban independence from Spain. Again, the Spanish, who have lost virtually all of their territory in the Americas, there's a desire to hold on, if for nothing else, the national prestige to this place called Cuba. On April the 9th, Spain essentially accepts McKinley's conditions, but they absolutely reject any idea of Cuban independence. It is then that William McKinley, who had been against intervention, shifts gears, and on April the 11th having gotten the Spanish response, asked Congress for authority to end the hostilities by using American military force. The argument in part is that the inhumane conditions in Cuba necessitate, for the purposes of civilized humanity, intervention by the United States. By joint resolution of Congress on April the 19th, Cuba is declared free of Spain. President McKinley is authorized to use whatever force is necessary to remove the Spanish from Cuba. But it's notable that even then, when the debate was ongoing about providing or authorizing military force and authorizing the president to use it, one amendment emerges, the so-called Teller Amendment, which disclaimed any desire on the part of the United States to annex Cuba. It turns out that the Teller Amendment will become American policy and will prevent Cuba in many ways from becoming part of the United States. That's how the war gets going. And I'll pick up in a subsequent lecture how it goes.